hit that button. Good evening and welcome to our latest coaches work session. And I'm excited tonight because I get to hang out with my friend who I normally don't get to see very often, Kelly Thompson. And probably nobody knows this because I don't like to share it with many people, but I've been trying to chase Kelly around and be as good as he is since he was the coach at Hutchinson High School when I first came back to the activity a decade ago. And I've had a lot of success, but it seems like I'm always in the shadow. And one of the coolest things about this activity is learning from the best in the business. And in my experiences, I found that Mr. Thompson's ability to coach young people in book events surpasses quite a few people in our activity. So I'm excited to learn from him how to teach book events and how to approach it. And I'd like to welcome Kelly Thompson from Lawrence Free State High School.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. I don't ever really pretend to be an expert in things, and so hopefully the expectation is not that you're going to hear from an expert or anything on things. But I do have some experiences that have informed the way that we operate at Free State, at least. And my hope is that something that I say might spark something in your head that might work for your program as well. I'm certainly not of the impression that everything works for every program. I think that each squad is different, certainly in its makeup of students, coaching staff, experience, etc. But background on me, I didn't do interp in high school. I didn't particularly want to coach forensics when I got to Hutchinson High School in 2009. I was coaching because I had to teach forensics debate. And as an NDC debater at Emporia State, that's all I really wanted to do was to coach debate. And after about 2 years of being mediocre at coaching debate and mediocre at coaching forensics, I decided that if 50% of my job was to coach forensics, that I'd probably figure out how to do it. And that's when I attended a workshop with, I'm not getting any feedback in my microphone. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
Ironically, given that she is present in the room, I attended a workshop with Miss Betsy Dutton, and she taught me a lot of things about coaching interp that I hardly ever considered, and took a lot of those things back to my classroom and kind of fell in love with forensics from that point forward. I would say that probably the thing that I think I do more than most other coaches, or maybe not, but that works really well for me is I learn a lot from my students. They are far more talented than I am, particularly when it comes to doing acting type things. And so I pay a lot of attention to the things that they think are actually true. And then I try to give them thoughts about things that might make it slightly better than what they're doing, or slightly different, or different perspectives things might look. And so I spend a lot of my time coaching, talking to students about different ideas for what things might look like, and then encouraging them to make their own decisions about how to implement those things within their given performances. And so I'm going to talk today specifically about interpretation. I'll talk about prose and poetry, and then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about poi as well, provided that I can learn how to use a computer. My goal today is to introduce the three events, dispel some misconceptions that people have about them, and maybe most importantly to me is to promote equity in the events. A lot of students who do prose, poetry, poi, exclusively book events within their kind of repertoire, and I know that they get somewhat irritated at people who kind of look down on them for doing events that they perceive as being events. And so my hope is to kind of dispel some of those notions and promote equity amongst the events. So we'll talk about what the event is, then I'll talk to you a little bit about how we select material, how we work individual events, and then I'll take questions at the end of each event. So let's prose first. Before that, I have kind of a set of 6 things that I kind of want to say about events, about book events generally. I think are important kind of ways to frame these particular events. Mike, do you want to admit these people that are in? dispel some myths. These are kind of things that I use to um, frame these events when we're talking about them, and I try to get the stuff in front of students before they ever get to a tournament. So one myth that exists kind of in the community writ large is that prose, poetry, poi are events for people who are students who are too lazy to memorize. I think that that is an unfair myth because I think that the people who perform best in this event are memorized, and the students who show up to tournaments, particularly towards the end of the season, we're talking about national qualification and the state tournament. Those students are memorized. And so I think that this is an unfair notion, and one that I heard multiple times throughout my high school career about prose and poetry, and things that I certainly tell my students that are not true as we're coaching them. These are also not events that coaches should just toss students into to fill entries or to fill student time. I think that this gives the impression and feeds into the notion that it's just a waste of time event, but it also wastes judges' time and gives them a bad impression of the event when 3 or 4 of the students in every section that they go into are reading something for the first time that they clearly don't care about and clearly don't know about. I think it gives the event a pretty bad image. We don't do that really in other events, so I don't really like that we do that in prose and poetry, kind of as a community. I think that prose and poetry provide a really great introduction for students who are experiencing anxiety about performances and competition. I think that while I want my students to memorize their book events, I think that the book can also be part of a security blanket of sorts for students who are experiencing anxiety. So I push a lot of young students into prose and poetry, especially who I think are experiencing some anxiety, because having the book there, even if they don't need it for the script, provides them some comfort and support. I also think that using prose and poetry to teach students essential skills for all other forensics events is really important. It's not usual for our students to do just prose and poetry as novices and then use their sophomore year to explore some of the interp or solo acting type events, and then to go back to doing prose and poetry or prose or poetry as seniors. I mean, our primary motivation there is predominantly always state sweeps points, which I'll talk about a little bit below, but for students use prose and poetry to learn skills that they're going to use for other events. Things like facial expression, tonal quality, etc., are things that are really hard for students to grasp when they're thinking about what they're doing physically with their bodies. So I find that oral interpretation really helps us keep students grounded in a singular location so that we can focus on those other things. I think that number 5, that prose and poetry provide really great balance within your squad. If your squad is a whole bunch of really great students at DI and a whole bunch of really great students at STEM, that's really exciting until you get to the semifinals of this tournament and you're competing against each other and you're knocking yourselves out of finals. And so I think that having balance across the different events is really important, and that's one of the reasons why we treat prose and poetry and poi the exact same, which leads into number 6, which is that all the events score the same number of points. Is not only unfair to the event and the students who do it and do it with a lot of work, but it also is mathematically factually incorrect. And so I think that you're kind of doing yourself a disservice if you're not treating prose and poetry the same way that you treat HSA and SSA or DIHI, because they all score the same amount of points, and there's no limit on the number of events that you can take or the number of entries you can take in each event at the state tournament. So, I mean, we took 5 poetries to state one year because we thought we were better than everyone else at poetry. And I mean, they were all in the top 13. So I think it turned out pretty well for us in that event. So, kind of just things that I wanted to vent about a little bit before I talked about the events. In particular, the definition of prose is taken from the Keisha Debate Journal Manual. I'm not going to read it to you because you can read paraphrase. Prose is a fiction or nonfiction story. And my is that prose should contain a plot. We tend to call all of our proses in the same way, where we put the entirety position necessary for the teaser, and we end the teaser with an inciting incident, and that leads us into the introduction. So we'll put all of the information that is necessary to learn about the relevant characters in the teaser, and then we'll get to whatever that that problem is going to be whatever the inciting incident is going to be for our plot at the end of the teaser, and that kind of leaves us with a bit of a cliffhanger that helps, we think helps get judges interested in the piece and keeps kind of engaged. Through an introduction that some judges just don't understand why we're like breaking up the middle of a piece of drama to do this random introduction, especially if they've never seen forensics before. We regularly cut and perform DIs or SSAs that we transition to prose pieces later. Often blocking is a consideration here if we're really struggling with what to do with a really great piece of drama, physically speaking. Then sometimes we will transition it into a prose piece because that eliminates the biggest problem with the piece. A great story, really compelling characters, great kid doing the piece. But our only problem is we don't know how to block it. Sometimes moving it to a prose really helps that. You're telling the same story, you're still telling a complete plot, you're just doing it in 70% of the amount of time. So that kind of tells you how we approach prose. I do want to mention prose is explicitly not a script. According to the case manual, and I think the NSDA manual reflects this as well, you can't use any scripts of any kind for prose. So TV, movie, play, musical scripts are not allowed in prose. You can use those in the solo acting or interp events, but you can't use those in the oral interp event of prose and poetry. It feels redundant. I've already said this, but I do think it's important. It's not just a throwaway event that you should give kids to fill an interest on Saturday morning. Because it gives it a bad image on the circuit, in my opinion. It's not an acting nor an interp event, it's oral interp, and that means that all of the blocking should be kept within the reach of the body, within a pivot foot. The manual says the performer's feet shall not move. Frustratingly, the manual doesn't say that there's a penalty for moving feet, so lots of people still move feet, but the rules are pretty clear that your feet shouldn't move because it's oral interp, and so I would caution you against having your students do things like that when they're doing it. I don't think that's nearly as big of a problem in prose in my experience as it is in poetry. We'll talk about that a little bit, but these are, again, just my opinions about things. I think that we should promote prose to students because it helps students grow performers. I talked about this kind of in the prelude part, but I think there's a lot of skills that students need as actors that are really difficult to teach if they're also focused on what they're doing physically, what they're doing with blocking, etc. And so thinking about pacing and dramatic pauses and what they're doing with their face and what tonally, all of those are really important, and they're the only things to worry about in oral interp. So if we can eliminate that physicality in prose and poetry, we can focus on these other skills that are going to help students become better performers. The second thing that I think is important to note is that prose and poetry do ease the burden on busy students. I know that I'm not alone in saying that a lot of my best students do a lot of other things. And so I don't think that prose and poetry are less work. And I tell my students that they're not going to do less work. Same practice requirements, the same reflection requirements, the same characterization requirements, etc. for any other event, but there are less things for them to mentally invest in within the piece, and ultimately that makes them less straining on students. So if you're doing a DI versus a prose, you're going to do the same amount of time working on that piece, at least on our team, but you're going to have to invest a lot less mental energy, which makes it a lot less stressful. At least that's been our experience for our students. We're selecting material for prose. Thing that I think that we do that maybe is different than a lot of other people is that we almost always prefer drama over comedy. And the reason I think that that's true is just because experience, and I'm kind of a big nerd, and so I've done like some data analysis about the differences between comedy and drama in prose, statistically speaking, and our experience is just that drama beats comedy regardless of the performer almost every time. So if you have two performers doing very good pieces at the top level, then the dramas beat the comedy. And I think there are probably a couple of reasons. One is because drama has a tendency to move people in a way that comedy just doesn't. Emotionally, it evokes something for people. And the second is because comedy is far more subjective than drama. People tend to think things that are sad or dramatic or etc. are sad or dramatic, etc. But not everybody thinks of the same things that are funny are funny, and so we tend to use drama for that reason. We like to use as much as possible first person dramatic fiction or autobiographies. We tend not to use literature that is third person or any other perspectives. We tend to use single character pieces more than multi character pieces, and I think that goes back to that like not moving your feet thing. I think it's a lot harder to characterize in prose and poetry, in prose, excuse me, than it is in solo acting or dramatic interp. And so we tend to use single character pieces that are written in first person. We tend not to include omniscient characters like narrators or etc. And the primary reason is just because we kind of think that narration just breaks up the plot quite a bit. And so that's like fine and good when you're reading, but if you're watching a performance, that narration sometimes breaks up the flow of the piece. And so we try to eliminate as much narration as possible from whatever prose that we're doing. Some things that I think that we do that I'm not sure a lot of other people do a lot of in terms of prose and poetry. And this is not an indict of anybody, just things that we do a lot of that seem to be helpful for our students. We do a lot of film study, and what I mean by that is that we watch a lot of other performers performing in every event, but particularly in prose, poetry, and poi. So we'll watch whatever videos we might be able to find on YouTube, whatever videos are available through our NSDA resource package, and a lot of other videos of our own students from the past that have been successful or unsuccessful, because you can learn a lot from videos that are not very good, just like you can learn a lot from videos that are very good. And so we do a lot of film study. So if a student is struggling with something in particular, I'll answer questions. I have a question thing coming up, and then I'll answer that question. So if we notice something that a student is doing, we might show them what we want it to look like or something like that. And so we do a lot of film study. We do a lot of book work, and when I'm judging oral interp, maybe this is the thing that frustrates me the most about what I see other students doing, and maybe that's why we spend a lot of time on it, I don't know, but how we hold the book, how we open and close the book, how we put the book down, all of those sorts of things are things that we spend a lot of time on and put a lot of energy into, and I'm not sure a lot of other people do. But the manual says, and the way that people tend to judge it is that the book is an integral part of the performance. So just like holding it kind of lackadaisically is somewhat irrelevant or somewhat short-sighted in terms of what the event is actually supposed to be. We do a lot of work with page turns. To be honest, we do a lot more work with page turns in poi and poetry than we do in prose, but page turns send a message. If you're turning it slowly, turning it really fast, or if you're turning it really aggressively, all of those things send a different message. And so we spend a lot of time about that. And then we also spend a lot of time working on introductions. We probably write 4 or 5 new introductions every year for every piece that we think is going to compete for a spot on our state team. And after we pick our state team, we always rewrite introductions again. So we spend a lot of time writing introductions, every word in the introduction, because it is a departure from the script. I just think the introductions are irrelevant. So if we put in time and effort to making sure that every word that we're saying in our introduction is important, we think that makes us stand out in a way that maybe a lot of other people don't. If a judge remembers our introduction but doesn't remember anyone else's, we think that's an advantage for us, because we're using the one time where we get to use our own words within the piece to tell why our message is important. Earlier, but I think it bears repeating, we don't sacrifice the work we do with our event in prose and poetry. So we're going to do the same amount of work that we would do in DI as we would do in prose. And so we're still going to do the same level of character analysis, the same level of story analysis, the same level of reflection. All of that stuff is the same for us with prose. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, where I said that equity is really important for being successful in these events. If your students think prose and poetry are the same as DI and HI, then they're going to invest the same amount of time and they're going to be serious about the work. And we think that that's really important. Probably the biggest change from me as a coach now versus me as a coach 8 years ago is that I think that overworking pieces is a real thing. And so we tend not to make a ton of big changes to what students are doing until April. And so we, of course, coach. We do practice sessions, etc., with our students all the way through. And our objective is to make the pieces as competitive as they can be. But in terms of like full scale writings or multiple runs of the same thing to make sure that it's perfect, those kinds of practices, we don't really do any of that in April anymore. And the goal there is just to make things feel very natural when we get to the most important for us. Which again, we're a very state-centered squad, and so pretty much everything we do is about getting ready for the state tournament. So we don't overworking the piece. I think is a real thing, and so I used to coach students to run the same prose 10 times a day, and making sure that everything was the same all 10 times. And I think that's short-sighted on my part, and I think that it made our stuff kind of stale by the time we got to the state tournament. And the last thing about prose is that I really think that this is important across all events, but I think that letting students make decisions that they believe in is really important to getting them to invest. And so my students are required to get feedback from multiple different people every week. They have to perform for 2 different classmates every week, as well as different coaches every week. And I encourage them to also perform for other teachers during like independent learning time or their parents or etc. And so the more feedback they're getting, the more options the students will have for their performances. And then we want them to choose which option makes the most sense to them, and letting them make those decisions about their performances and then helping them to refine those decisions is really what we view as our kind of central goal as coaches. We don't want to make all of the decisions for students and their performances. We want to help them make their decisions as competitive as possible. And so giving them as much feedback as possible allows us to let them make those decisions. And I think that that's really important as well. So I'll pause here. I'll answer questions if anyone has any. Someone asked what the NSDA resource package is. For all NSDA member schools, you have access to a set of resources that the NSDA puts out, and you can also purchase for, I think it's like $100 a year, $150 a year, an additional resource package that gives you access to a bunch more resources, specifically for us at least, videos of national final rounds and national semifinal rounds. Mike says it's $199. I think that he's right that that's the standard price, but if you pay it before like September 7th or something, they give you a discount. And so even if, my opinion is that even if your school isn't going to go to NSDA Nationals, that being an NSDA member school for access to those resources, I think is really valuable. At least it is for our students. And so that's something that you might consider if you haven't already done it. But one of the things I really love about resource package is that if your students are members on your school roster, then they can also access all of those resources. And I think that's obviously really important and valuable, because I don't have every kid sit down and watch all of these DIs I'm telling my DI kids to watch, etc.
I do have a quick question on, and I know this will come sometime later, but are they ever going to have something on the different national championships? Because I don't even know the difference. I don't know anything about them. Do you know?
That's something that maybe, Mike, maybe you can set that for a future date, is just like all of the different options for national competition that people have. Because there are like
we are going to set a question and answer.
Okay.
We're going to have a question and answer session in a week or 2.
Excellent. I didn't even know you were here, Russ. Hi. Other questions about prose? Okay. I'm going to move on then to poetry, which is my favorite event to coach by quite a wide margin. I don't really know why. I never really liked poetry before I started coaching, but I don't. Anyway, again, the Keisha definition of what poetry is. It kind of sounds like gibberish to me, and so we operate from the perspective of, if an author says that what they've published is poetry, then we call it poetry, and if not, then it's not poetry. The one exception to that is probably like music lyrics, which we consider poetry. And I think the manual does as well, or at least it's been ruled on or something. I don't know. Anyway, so we use music lyrics and what authors call poetry, because what is poetry, I think, is kind of a nebulous thing that I get frustrated about when we have to argue about it. We think that poetry collections should contain an arc somewhere, and what I really mean by that is a climax, even if not a complete plot. And I would say that probably about 60 to 70% of our poetry collections do have a complete plot. They might not be discernible to somebody who's not like dissecting the cutting that we're doing, but they do have a complete plot. But at the very least, every collection that we cut has a climax. And I think that that's really important because poetry naturally doesn't always have a climax, but I think in performance, it's really important that you're building towards a climax. And I think it helps give students direction in their piece that is really valuable when you start talking about things like beat changes and pacing and those sorts of things. And so every poetry collection that we have has at least one climax, and sometimes we have multiple climaxes within a piece. And so anyway, I think that's important. Poetry collections can have multiple characters and perspectives, but it's also okay if they don't. We get a lot of feedback from people that says that like if we have multiple different poems, every poem needs to be a different character. And I don't really know where that like thought process came from. It doesn't really make sense to me, and so we just don't do it. But my opinion is that it's okay if a poetry is one person, even if it's 10, like one character, even if it's 10 different poems. I think that the topic and theme is the most important component to poetry. There is so much poetry available to students now that wasn't when I was in high school, or when many of you were in high school. And so our experience suggests that regardless of what the topic is, we can pretty much find poetry to create a collection for that student. And so what the theme is and the student's connection to it is far more important than the individual poem. So I regularly have students bring me a piece of poetry and they're really excited about it. They really like it. They're like, I really like this poem. And I'm like, okay, that's great. What's the theme of your collection though? Because the 90-second poem you've put in front of me is not a collection and we can't compete with that. So how do we build a theme around that, that we can use that poetry for? And so I always tell them that, what is your connection to the theme that you want to talk about? And why is that important? That's really where we start poetry from most of the time, because that's just far more important. Again, redundant at this point, but poetry is not a throwaway event for people who don't work hard. And I'll say poetry is not just an event for people of color. I literally had sitting in an award ceremony at the state tournament in 2014, and the state finalists were 6 people of color, and one of the students in a row in front of me turned to one of their friends and said something like, I guess we know what you have to do to be in the finalist in poetry or something like that. And I was obviously furious, et cetera, et cetera. But I do know this is a stereotype that exists in the circuit, in the national circuit. And I think it's just really important that there's really great poetry that they can be successful with as well. And just because you're a person of color in poetry doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do well. Like, I think that's it's also not just for corny and cliche topics or literature, though. I will say that cliche topics and literature often do very well in poetry. There's lots of really cool things that you can do with poetry that don't require that to be true. One of the reasons why we do poetry a lot and we're really invested in it is because a lot of my students really love poetry outside of forensics. And so I have a lot of students who attend like coffee shop poetry readings or write their own poetry. I don't know about all, but like it seems like 50% of my squad is in therapy. And I don't know if that's good or not, but one of the things that their therapists like are teaching them to do is write poetry. So I have all these students coming in who are already writing poetry, and obviously we can't use that poetry, but they have a natural interest in it already that is not specific to forensics. And so if they're already excited about poetry, getting them excited about performing poetry, we found is really a lot easier. And so we spend a lot of time and energy in poetry because my students just like it. I think that other than Poi, the reason I like poetry more than any other event besides Poi is because it's happened to students' natural creativity, perhaps more than other events, because you're able to pull from multiple different poems and even types of poetry to create one singular collection. Students who are very creative, I think, tend to really love that kind of cutting nature of poetry that isn't necessarily the same for any other event as in prose and TI and HI, etc. You have to have a plot and you have to, kind of follow this natural progression of how the story goes or whatever. And it all has to be from one piece of literature. But in poetry and Poi, you get to pull from lots of different places. And the last reason I think the poetry is really important and valuable is just because students' voice is really important and valuable. And poetry is a really great way for students to be able to use that voice or to kind of actuate that voice. And so the rhythm and beat of poetry allows students to feel their words a lot differently than most other events. And so one of the reasons why we do poetry a lot is because I think it maybe is the most effective way for us, for me and for my students to kind of use that voice in a way that we think is really valuable and important to us. And so we spend a lot of time on poetry because of all of those things. Two things that we don't do so this is selecting material. Things we don't do in poetry that I think maybe other squads do some of, if not almost exclusively of. We don't perform single poems. And so there are some single poems that are like 5 to 7 minutes long or longer that theoretically you could do as a poetry performance, but we don't do that. I guess I don't know why, other than they haven't been competitively successful when we have. But they just are typically not very stimulating for the students who are attracted to poetry. A lot of the students, I've already said this, but a lot of the students that do poetry for us write their own poetry. And so they are always saddened when they learn they can't write their own poetry for competition. Then when I tell them they can pull from a lot of different poems to create a collection, then they get really excited about that because they can't write their words, but they can reorganize stanzas, lines and stanzas in a way that they like. And so it's not writing their own poetry, but in a lot of ways it's creating their own performance. And so I guess why we don't do single poems. We also don't do stack poems. And what I mean by that is that we might have 8 poems that are all about dogs, but we're not going to read all of poem 1 and then all of poem 2 and then all of 3 and all of 4 and so on. Instead, we're going to splice those poems. And what I mean by that is that we're going to take parts of each of those poems and we're going to rearrange them in different lines and stanza orders so that they're kind of intermingled within each other to create one cohesive story. And 99% of the poetry collections that you'll see our students do are spliced in that way. And that's what students really love doing about poetry. I'm perfectly honest, I think that I'm a pretty good poetry coach, but splicing poetry is the thing I can't do, and it might be the most important thing, but I'm just not creative in the way. And so my students do all of their own splicing, and then I kind of help them with other parts of it pretty good at. But I don't, anyway, everything we do is spliced pretty much. We also don't use very many poems in their entirety, and so we don't use very many poems in their entirety. We use parts of poems to make collections. And so I think maybe that's something that people do differently. We typically aim for, I've been asked this question a lot, like how many poems do you do in a collection? And obviously every collection is different, so that depends on what you're trying to create. But I'd say on average between 5 and 10. At one point I did an average and it was like 7.5 or something. So 5 to 10 probably makes the most sense. I don't know what it is over the last couple of years, but I don't really know that any of us know anything that's happened in the last 2 years. And so I don't know, but 5 to 10 is probably about average. One of the things that we like to do is we like to take poems that are very popular and maybe even overdone or cliche and use them in new or unique ways. And so when I started coaching, like actually coaching poetry around like 2011 or something like that, a poem that we saw a lot of on the circuit was Phenomenal Woman. And so I had a student who wanted to do Phenomenal Woman. And so we really kind of dissected Phenomenal Woman and used it in a new and different way that was really fun and interesting and exciting. And people really loved because they were hearing a poem that they were familiar with, but it would intermingle with lots of other stuff that they hadn't heard before. And people were really engaged with it, and it did really well for us. So we like to use cliche poems that lots of people know, but we like to use them in new or interesting or unique ways because judges really like to know something about what they're hearing, especially in a round of poetry where they probably haven't heard very much of anything or they've heard all of something. And so that's been really successful for us. This is all redundant almost, except that a couple of things that I think are a little bit different for poetry. I talked about film study and book work. I talked about page turns in terms of like how fast or slow you're doing them, how aggressively or passively you're doing them, etc., etc. All those things are still important for poetry, but the other thing that we think is super important for poetry, and maybe what I'm best at in coaching poetry, is deciding where to put page turns. And so I think that a lot of students that we compete against just kind of like fill up their pages with text, and then that's where they turn their page when their page is full or whatever. And we're very much not like that. And so it's not uncommon for us to have like 4 pages in a row that each have one line. It's not uncommon for us to have like one stanza on a page and then a turn, or 4 or 5 stanzas on a page and then a turn. But we are very meticulous about where those page turns go. And so that's something that's unique to poetry and poi that you don't really do in prose. At least we don't most of the time. The other 2 differences, I talked about what splicing is. So we spend a lot of time on splicing. And then the other is then introductions. We always end our introductions with an impact statement. And so a lot of introductions will just end with like the title and the author. And so in poetry poi, we end our introductions with what we call an impact statement, which is just like a collection because, and then it's like our why. Why are we doing this piece? Why is our performance important? What is the message or the thesis that we want people to take away from it? And we're going to put that sentence after our titles and authors portion of our introduction, which sometimes is really long because we might be using 10 poems in a piece. And so we're going to do all of our titles and authors, and then we're going to say a collection because, and then we're going to insert what we call our impact statement. And like I said, we spend a lot of time on introductions. We probably write 4 or 5 different versions for every piece that competes for our state scene by the season is over. So one of the things I talked earlier in prose a little bit about not overworking a piece, but I think that's maybe more important in poetry. The natural flow that language has in poetry, the rhythm, the beat, sound, all of that stuff is really important. And so overworking it to where that becomes mechanical, I think is maybe something that a lot of coaches do when they're just starting out doing poetry. And I was certainly guilty of this early in my career. The other thing that's important is prose to use the book as a prop in the performance, which I think that you should do. In poetry, I think that's sometimes harder. And I think it's harder because poetry is so much more verbal. It's so much more about the language and the style. And so we want to make sure that everything we're doing with the book is motivated by what we want our character to be demonstrating. But we also want to make sure that we are actually doing things with our book. It's really easy to just hold the book for 7 minutes in a poetry collection and not ever move it, but be a really great performance. But we think that probably using the book as a piece of the performance is going to set us apart from a lot of other people. So we always want to make sure we're doing something with the book. We kind of have an unwritten rule. We try to do 4 things with the book in a poetry collection. And so we're going to use the book. We're going to try to use the book 4 different times in 4 different ways beyond just being the script that we're reading from in our performance. The other thing that we're going to try to do, because so much of poetry is about that kind of natural flow and rhythm, we're always going to also try to create the illusion of movement. So we are going to move our hips a lot. We're going to move our arms a lot. We're going to move our torsos a lot. We're going to move at our knees a lot. We're not going to move our feet. We are going to move our bodies a lot. We're going to create that movement. And some of that's very natural. You know, when you see people who are natural poetry performers or singers, especially, tend to move when they perform. And we're going to have some of that for sure. We're also going to have movement that creates an illusion that our character is moving around the stage, kind of like they really were acting. We're going to spend a lot of time on the introduction, or we'll spend a lot of time on how we go into the introduction, how we come out of the introduction, and how we end the performance. The last line of the poetry performance, I think, is really important. I think that's true for Poi and DI also, probably more than the other events. But we're going to spend a lot of time considering what we want to end the piece is the last thing that we want to say. I think that's everything. Poetry. Questions about poetry that you might have that I can give my comments on?
Kelly, real quickly, you came up with the idea of using the book 4 times and in 4 different ways. Why that magic number 4?
I don't really know. It's not like a science thing. It's more like this feels right thing. And so it's not a hard and fast rule, but I would say once every 90 seconds just makes sense within a performance. If you watch a performance for about 90 seconds and the performer's just standing there, you're more likely to turn away or to look down or something like that, perhaps. So that's probably our objective there. Rules on what you can do with a book. There aren't any. The rule says that the book has to contain the manuscript. The manual says that the book manuscript should be read. I think it says shall be read. I don't really want to have a debate, but the shall be read, I think, is what the manual says. And so beyond those 2 things, there aren't really rules about what you can do with it. Although I don't remember if it's one of the national organizations has a rule the book can't leave your hands. And I think it might be NSDA. I don't remember. But, so like one of the things that we did once was like we slammed our book onto the ground at one point, and we got lectured for that. So you can't leave the book with your hand. We'll close the book and use it maybe as a pillow or as something to write on, like a clipboard or something like that. We've used the book as like a baby. If our piece is about a mom, we might cradle our book like a baby. We've used it as a flag, so we'll wave it around kind of like a flag. Obviously not an exhaustive list, but those are kind of some examples of things that we might do with our book. We also did a piece, my personal opinion is it's the best performance that I've ever coached. It was about how racialized violence was cliche. And so something we did that we really loved the book was we used a white book instead of a black book, and we turned our pages backwards instead of forwards to kind of like that wasn't like using the book as a prop or anything, but it was like something with the book that I thought kind of helped stand out. So that's a short list of examples.
Can I interject a little bit, Kelly?
Of course.
You're doing a great job because as you know, we do all of that stuff. So almost all of those things. I'm stealing a couple of ideas I didn't know, but the Acacia rules on prose and poetry are ambiguous at best. One rule says you can't have any props. Another rule says that the manuscript must be an integral part of the performance. And so because of where I live, when my kids compete in Kelly's side of the state or in Wichita, we're going to do what we do. We use the book too. We're going to do that no matter where we're at. But when we're on his side of the state or we're at larger tournaments, we never get a protest. When we are in Southwest Kansas or on some smaller circuits, we will occasionally get a protest that we are using the book as a prop. I can tell you that in my career, I have won that protest more than I've lost it, but we have lost it a couple of times and had kids disqualified at a tournament. And so there is a level of maybe knowing what your circuit is like. If it's just state level stuff, that might be worth noting. I would also say just do it. And the more we all do it, the more likely we can get the rule clarified. But that's me.
So basically the rule really is, again, like you said, depending on the circuit, the rule really is that the book can be kind of a prop. You're basically using it as a prop. I think right now I'm not going there with my kids because they're just trying to like get the voice and stuff. And we don't have a class, so we haven't had as much practice. But I can already tell the book is the biggest problem I'm having. Like I actually had to close my eyes and not watch the book today to see what the problem was. And I realized she was vocally perfect, but the book was driving me crazy. And so I'm really glad to hear that because there's a part where she says slap, like she's talking about abuse over and over. And once she knows it well enough, I want her to slap that book, even if she slaps it shut, but I didn't know if that was allowed. So.
Yeah, no, we would absolutely do that. The one thing that we try to do is to not have our book closed for more than about 7 to 10 seconds at a time. Because one comment we do get pretty regularly is you're not reading your script if your book is closed, which is obviously true. And so we do sometimes have to be cognizant of how long we're doing those kinds of things, but we would absolutely do exactly what you're describing. We would absolutely slam the book shut for something like that, and then we would reopen it.
Okay.
You
said you used a white book, so that's my other question: is the little small black book not required? It does not matter.
No.
I have a kid already cut a piece into a book, and it's a big book, and I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna have to recut that into that little book.
Yeah, I've seen students use the bigger binders. My opinion is just that they're a little bit harder to hold, a little bit clumsier, but certainly you can do that. I've seen kids in the past use the music binders you might get in band class. And so it's just about what you have available for sure. There's no rules on what the book has to look like. It just
Can it have any cover on it? Can it have their name on it or anything on the outside?
It's not supposed to have any words because you're not supposed to show words to the judge. That would be considered a prop, I think, in most protests. And so you can't show any words to the judge. I think if you had a name on it and you weren't holding it up to the judge, probably nobody's ever going to care. But we certainly always try to make sure our books are blank on the outside.
And then the only other question on poetry, especially and maybe prose, but poetry, the way I'm cutting it is like what you're saying, where you put some lines, some of it's more. And I did that intentionally because what I noticed when they had it on one page, they were just reading it instead of putting the voice into it because they were anticipating what was next. But and maybe this isn't allowed, I was putting bolding words I wanted them to remember to say louder. And I was putting in parentheses notes to them. Is that allowed?
Absolutely. You know what I mean? Yeah. You can have whatever you want.
Quiet, louder. I was giving them almost stage cues.
All of those age directions. Yeah, you can definitely do that. There's no rules against that.
Okay. I had a moment. I'm maybe I'm not supposed to do that.
That's certainly okay.
Okay.
Other people might disagree with me, but any other questions about poetry? Okay, let's talk about poi. Some of the stuff is redundant, some of it's not. Poi, I think, is by far, in a way, the coolest event. I'm not very good at coaching it yet, but I really love it. And I really love it because I think that it is a combination of every other discipline that we teach kids in forensics into one event. And I think that's really cool. I think that a lot of times our actors have a difficult time understanding or conceptualizing what voice looks like in forensics when we talk about the power of their voice and telling their story, using the voice to make people feel, understand that from a character or a plot point of view, but not from an activist point of view. And so I think that poi has really helped kind of open their eyes to how they can use their abilities as actors to really impact change in the way people feel and think. And I think poi really, really cool. I will say, important to me at least, because it is a conflation of every other forensic discipline in our opinion, we don't have freshmen on our team do POI. We have to do other events that we think will help prepare them to do POI so that they can do POI in the future, but we don't have freshmen on our team do POI. In my opinion, it's just a lot. I would rather students learn how to do the other things they need to do to be successful in POI first, rather than trying to learn POI and either being overwhelmed by how difficult it was or how poorly they were doing with it because it's technical, or learning how to do it wrong. So we haven't had freshmen do POI. Someday maybe I'll feel differently about that. It's still a pretty new event. I think this is what we're 6, 7 of POI, and so maybe I'll feel differently about that at some point. But we don't have freshmen do POI on our team. It's not deep with a book. I think that sometimes when you see POIs that are happening at the national tournaments, sometimes they look and feel a lot like DI with a book, at least in my opinion. And certainly I think that a lot of times, at least 15 years ago, this might not be true anymore, but on the collegiate circuit, I think that POI a lot of times looked like DI with a book. But it's not that. It's just a reading script, and it's not just a prose or poetry event with longer time limit. These are all just like cliches that I hear other people say about POI that I think are important to kind of dispel. I've already told you I think that it is by far and away the coolest event because it allows students to use their creativity in ways that the other events don't. It allows them to use their voice to argue for things that they think is really valuable. It really is just an interp oratory or an interpretation or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's really what it is, and the possibilities with that are limitless. There's no limits on the type of literature you can use, no limits on the amount of different literature that you can use there. And so because of that, really literally the sky is the limit for how students can create their performances. And I already mentioned this in poetry, but splicing these things is the that I think I am worse at when it comes to coaching poetry and POI. And so I don't do that stuff for my students. Instead, they do it, and then I maybe give some feedback on things I don't think are working, but I'm very rare when I tell them this is what you should do instead when it comes to their cutting, because in nearly every instance, the students are much smarter in that way than I am, and I presume to tell them to change the things. I'm just going to tell them that it's working and then see if they'll bring me something new. A thing that I like about POI, especially for some of my sophomore students who come back and, okay, we all have these kids, right? Like, they come back and you're like, why? I don't understand why this person came back because they never won anything and they're not super talented and they don't necessarily work very hard and they only went to 3 tournaments, whatever. Sometimes I really like to put those kids in POI because those events tend to be really small because it's pretty new and POI is a really hard event. And so I can send a kid who's not the most talented kid into a POI tournament that only has 7 or 8 entries, and they're going to win a medal. And they're going to be really excited about that, and I'm going to be so excited for them. And so I like to use POI for those kids a lot. And those I'll never stick with POI because it's so hard, in my opinion. But I do send those kids into POI quite a bit. Because they find some success there because it's small. Unlike prose and poetry, which are the crutch, but those tend to be huge. Very hard to medal in prose and poetry at most tournaments. We always start the same way we would start an oratory, and that is by writing a thesis statement. And so our argument, what is the point? What do we want to get across to our judges and audience? And then we're going to go find all the material that we think we might use. And by that, I literally just mean collecting those things. So what proses are we going to use? What periodicals are we going to use? If we're going to use dramas, what dramas we're going to use, etc. Then we're going to write an outline. After we've collected all of our different material that we're going to get, we're going to write an outline. I think that a plot is very helpful, but it doesn't have to be a plot. I do think that it needs to have a climax. And then you're going to splice that POI, and you're going to do it kind of like writing an oratory, but obviously with far less of your own words. And so you're going to have this persuasive element throughout, kind of interlaced throughout the event, because the goal is ultimately to be persuasive with your POI. The introduction takes more time with Poi than any other event. I think some of that is just because it's persuasive in nature. Some of it is because there tends to be a little more technical stuff, like you need to list each a piece of literature that you're using and the author and the type of literature. So, like if you're doing 3 or 4 periodicals, you can say the periodicals dot 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 dot, dot and the prose, but you have to say not only the title and author, but the author of literature. And then, so we're going to spend a lot of time writing the instructions. It says what we need to do. We're going to decide on our characters if we have multiple characters. You don't have to have multiple characters in Poi, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find Pois that are competing at the national level in the out rounds that don't have multiple characters. And my experience has been that that's true at the state tournament, at least the 6A state tournament as well. And so I think that characters are important for it. Figure out where your climax is. The other thing that makes Poi different than prose and poetry is that in Poi can move your feet. And so we create a lot of levels in our performance in the same way that we would for dramatic interp or humorous interp. And so we're going to move side to side in the room, and we're going to move front to back in the room, and we're also going to move up and down. I put up and down. Sorry about that. Up and down in our room more than obviously we would in prose or poetry. So we're going to create some movement. We did some really cool things with that last year with the camera that we really liked. So that's something that you can certainly do. Again, though, you're not supposed to use the book like you're not supposed to have a prop, and so you're going to use the book in a similar way to prose and poetry. But there have been a couple instances where people have like tried to show words or things to the judges in the book, and you're not really supposed to do that. That rule might be new. Not even a rule, I don't know. But we don't do that. But we create levels and movement in prose and poetry that make it very different than, or in Poi that make it very different than prose and poetry. We do, these are probably everybody does character drills, I don't know, where we just have students run through each character. So we'll do like a kind of a round robin thing. We'll have different people in the room call out different characters, and the person will like pop into that character and say a line in that character's voice or whatever. And so we'll do that with Poi, especially early when we're trying to get those characters down. We still do a lot of things with page turns and book work, just like we do for prose and poetry. And then we always end with something that we call a lingering thought. We want the judge to take something away. So that final point is going to be kind of something that we want the judge to kind of stew about. When the judge goes back to fill out their ballot, we want them to think about our performance and be like, you know, that really made me think about X or Y or Z or whatever. And so we're going to always try to end with some sort of a lingering thought in Poi as well. That is the end of what I have to share. I was told an hour, and that was 58 minutes, so that's pretty good. I'm going to unshare my screen. Actually, I'll leave this up for a minute if you want to write down my email address. I am happy to ever answer questions. I've got some videos of my kids doing these events that I'm happy to share with you, especially from last year. I love having all these unlisted YouTube links of my kids' performances from last year that I can share with my students. And I'm happy to share those with you as well if you're interested in seeing what this stuff has looked like for us. Like I said, I don't think that I'm an expert by any means, but we do tend to be successful in these events. I do think that the number one reason why we're successful in these events, and I'll answer questions, the number one reason why we're successful in these events is because we treat it like every other event. We don't treat it any differently than that. And yes, Mike, I saw your thing, and I'm going to try to figure out how to do that.
Okay, so I have a question on the move. I know you can't move your feet, but it like, and I don't know if I dreamed this or the rule has changed, but when I was in school, we did the intro, we would turn around and then turn back around and start. Is that something that's allowed? I don't know if I dreamed that or not, but we used to do that. You know what I'm saying? Like,
we used to do that. I know what you're talking about. We used to do that in interp. I've never seen that done in prose and poetry. I do think technically it would be a violation of the rule, but to Russ's point about the ambiguity of the Acacia manual, there's no penalty for it. So I think you can probably do whatever you want.
Okay, so instead, maybe can you have them look down and look back up so that they can show the difference when they're starting?
Absolutely. We do that in prose poetry and poetry just by opening and closing the book.
Okay. Okay.
So that might be a thought.
I know I used to do it a long time ago. I did poetry in high school, and that's the one I went to state in every year. We used to do it, and then I was like, I don't remember not being able to move, but it's been a long time. So
yeah, and I know that there are still coaches who at least let, if not actively coach their students to move in the events, and they do that because there's no penalty in the manual, and the manual should have a penalty so that coaches stop doing that. But
I'm not going to break the rules.
It's definitely a thing. It's definitely a thing
But
that people still do. So,
but there's no rule that says that you could deliver if you have a teaser in your prose or even in your poetry and you break to do your intro, you could do a pause, you could do a turn, you could do whatever. There's nothing that prohibits that, as long as you're staying within that interp box. Now, some of us are old enough to remember that we coached where if you moved your pivot foot outside of the magical interp box, it now separated interp from acting. And we've seen we have seen where duo interp has gone with this, but we've also seen how the book events, there's a lot of movement. There's no issue here of turning your back.
Okay. And I think the other thing, they think they can't move their feet at all. And I said, you can shift your weight. It's not like you have to stand there with your knees locked. Please don't. I don't want you passing out on me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You can shift your weight, but my interpretation of the rule book is different than the manual is a performer's feet shall not move. And so I think lifting your feet to pivot or etc. is moving.
Yeah, but they're not moving. They're not performing in that moment. They're doing their introduction. I don't know. We were taught differently, I guess. So
the manual says,
I know for sure.
The manual says shall not move except for one small step at transitions is actually what the wording is in the manual.
Oh.
Yeah. It's very ambiguous. I feel like Boy is going to have a huge impact on these events in the coming 2 or 3 years. And I think we're going to be looking at rules, but that's my opinion.
Yeah. Real quickly, if I could, as Gloria Goodwin in Kansas City, I was so glad to hear you talk about Poi being that multifaceted, all content kind of piece. The last 2 finals that I went to before the pandemic interruption in Poi, the winners were people who did one singular piece, like one prose piece and memorized it, and then just did a lot of movement with it. And I got so frustrated, and I sort of filed a quasi complaint saying I thought this was supposed to contain a lot of source material. And so I was really glad to hear you say that. Is there a number of pieces? You talked about the number of pieces that you like to do in terms of poetry. We're like adding news sources, and we're adding pieces of novels, and we're adding poetry and plays and that sort of thing into it. Is there a number of pieces in a poi that you think works really well?
Honestly, I don't think that we've got or done enough poise for me to have a strong opinion about that, because it's pretty new. So I don't think that I have like a hard and fast number. Honestly, I couldn't tell you. We had a poi that won state last year, and I have no idea how many pieces were in it. I couldn't tell you.
Isn't the rule, or am I crazy? Isn't the rule you have to have one from at least 2 genres?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
And that rule is in the manual for sure.
Okay. Is poi hard to and I don't know if it's just the events we signed up, that we're not signed up for a ton. I'm not seeing poi being offered, and I know it's not all divisions have it. Which ones have it again? Because I'm struggling. I have a girl with a poi, and I've yet to be able to get her to a tournament. For the ones we signed up
Large
for.
large
I know that 5 and
classifications
6
have
have
poi.
it.
I'm sorry, what?
5
I know
and
that
6
5 and
A
6
have it.
schools.
Okay. I know 3A does too, because that's
Three
where
and four, 3 and 4 do too. It's 2 and 1 that don't.
okay, maybe that's the problem.
2A and 1A don't.
We've signed up for liberal in some of those schools as well. So I'm hoping once we get to those, right now we're going to really tiny schools. So that's probably the problem.
I do know that in our league, because we're GWAC, we do try to have poi as one of our competition events.
I'm sorry, I could barely hear you. Could you say that one more time?
All right, I know that GWAC does try to have poi as an event.
Okay,
Unfortunately, it usually doesn't go because we only have maybe 2 or 3 students who are interested in it. But I know that there's been push to try to have students competing in poi,
okay.
for at least our league, just so you're aware.
I've been talking to the girl about if it continues to maybe cut. Right now, there's like mostly poetry, I think, in it. There's a little bit of other things, and it's making a poetry because it's really good and she really likes the piece. She can't perform it if we don't until we can sign up for a competition for it. So, Russ, do you guys tend to have poi at your tournament make?
We will offer it and we will make sure it makes one way or another. I'm pretty pushy about trying to get people to host it, so.
Okay.
We will as well.
I do know that in my tournament, I'm going to try to host it. I'm going to have that event.
And what
Because
school
I
are you
have-
in again?
I'm Cimarron.
Oh, I think
Donnie
we're-
and Russ come to the tournament, so I try to make sure that they are taken care of.
I'm pretty sure you're on my calendar. Have you sent the invite or am I crazy?
I have not yet. But
Okay, I'm just making sure. I think you were on my
so-
calendar for some reason though. Okay, good,
Yep.
good.
What was that, Johnny?
Can you hear me now? Yay. Okay. When is yours? I don't have
April
you on my
9th.
calendar. April 9th. Okay. Awesome.
Last chance.
Great.
I got confirmation from my principal that we can definitely host next year, so I will make sure that we do that so we can also offer some of that stuff as well.
All right, are there any other questions for Mr. Thompson? Aside from the technical nuances of interpretations of the Acacia Handbook regarding poetry that have been discussed at length for decades in the state of Kansas and across the nation.
Is Dr. Seuss poetry or I'm sorry.
All right, if there aren't any other questions for Mr.
Know my answer.
If there aren't any other questions for Mr. Thompson, I want to thank him for coming out and talking. I know I learned
Thank you,
a
Kelly.
ton of
Thank you very
things that I'm going to take back to my classroom, including stealing this PowerPoint to incorporate into what I do. So thank you, Kelly. And thank you to all of you that joined us tonight. I'll put a recording of this up on YouTube if you want to access it later or show it to your kids. And feel free to contact Kelly if you have any additional questions.
Like I said, I am happy